The kitchens beneath the Galactic Embassy smelled of steam and forgotten Earth, where a single father cooked meals no alien would taste. They called his food primitive, his spices crude, his tortillas a folded mess unworthy of diplomatic plates. But when Princess Nyssa of Arcturus arrived with her court of sneering nobles, she would learn that some flavors carry more than taste. They carry memory, love, and the kind of truth that breaks through prejudice like fire through ice. And one bite of carne asada would change everything she thought she knew about worth. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The Galactic Embassy rose like a crystal blade against Earth's sky, its towers humming with the language of 1,000 worlds. Inside its marble halls, diplomats from 9 systems gathered beneath chandeliers that pulsed with bioluminescent fire. They debated treaties, traded insults wrapped in silk, and dined on molecular cuisine that dissolved on the tongue like expensive air. But 3 levels below, where the ceiling dripped with condensation and the walls remembered older fires, Thomas Blake stood alone in a kitchen no one important ever saw. His hands moved with the practiced grace of a man who had cooked through grief. Onions fell in perfect crescents beneath his blade. Cilantro released its green song into the humid air. The grill hissed as he laid down skirt steak, the meat darkening under flames that knew no diplomacy, only heat and time. Steam curled around his face, softening the lines that loss had carved there. His chef's coat, once white, had faded to the color of old paper. The name stitched above his heart read Blake, nothing more. No title, no rank, just a man who fed the people, who mattered. Above him, the embassy's grand dining hall blazed with a different kind of light. Servers in shimmering uniforms carried trays of dishes that looked like art and tasted like concept. Alien dignitaries praised the innovation, the boldness, the way a single bite could rewrite their understanding of flavor. None of them asked where the food came from. None of them wondered about the human in the basement who prepped their vegetables, cleaned their pans, and kept the kitchen running when the celebrity chefs took their bows. Thomas did not mind. He had learned long ago that visibility was a luxury, and he had spent his currency elsewhere. On the counter beside him sat a worn wooden cutting board, its surface scarred by 1,000 meals. He ran his thumb along one deep groove, remembering the day his daughter had tried to help him dice tomatoes. She had been 7, stubborn, insisting she was old enough. The knife had slipped, and she had cried more from embarrassment than pain. He had wrapped her finger, kissed her forehead, and taught her to curl her knuckles like a cat's paw. She had learned. She had been so proud. The steak finished with a sizzle that sounded like applause meant for no one. Thomas lifted it onto a plate, sliced it against the grain, and tucked the tender pieces into fresh tortillas he had pressed that morning. He added onions, cilantro, a squeeze of lime, and a spoonful of salsa that burned bright as a promise. The taco sat on the plate, humble and whole, folded like a secret only he knew how to keep. Upstairs a bell chimed. The diplomats were hungry again. Thomas covered the taco with foil, set it aside, and returned to work. Some meals were not meant for them. Princess Nyssa of Arcturus arrived on a Tuesday morning when the earth sky bled pink with industrial dawn. Her ship descended like a falling star, all silver angles and impossible grace, landing on the embassy's rooftop platform with barely a whisper. She emerged draped in robes that shifted color with her mood, currently a cold violet that matched her disposition. Her skin shimmered with the opalescent quality of deep ocean creatures, and her eyes, triple-irised and luminous, saw more than most beings thought decent. She was young by Arcturian standards, barely past her 2nd century, but her bloodline stretched back to when stars were named by those who sailed between them. Her entourage followed like a comet's tail, advisors and attendants who whispered flattery and adjusted her train. High Chancellor Vorik led them, his scales catching light like shattered mirrors. Ambassador Reeve walked 2 steps behind, her antennae twitching with bureaucratic anxiety. And at the rear, almost invisible, Attaché Kess carried tablets and tried not to trip. The welcome ceremony lasted 3 hours. Speeches in languages that tasted like copper and honey. Treaties signed with light instead of ink. Thomas watched from the service entrance, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres no one would eat. The celebrity chef, a Valorian named Xanth, had prepared them tiny architectural miracles that cost more than Thomas made in a month. Princess Nyssa picked at one, her expression suggesting she'd bitten into philosophy and found it wanting. The first meal was scheduled for evening. Xanth prepared a 7-course molecular experience designed to challenge perceptions and redefine taste. Thomas prepped the vegetables, cleaned the pans, and stayed invisible. He watched through the kitchen's observation window as the princess pushed food around her plate with the enthusiasm of someone attending their own funeral. High Chancellor Vorik praised every course with aggressive enthusiasm. Ambassador Reeve nodded along, her antennae drooping with exhaustion. Between the 5th and 6th courses, Attaché Kess slipped into the kitchen, carrying a tray of barely touched plates. She looked tired, her bioluminescent patterns dim with stress. Thomas offered her water. She drank it gratefully, then hesitated, seeing the taco he'd made himself for dinner, sitting wrapped on the counter. Her eyes widened with curiosity. "What is that?" she asked. Thomas unwrapped it carefully. "Just dinner," he said. She leaned closer, inhaling. "It smells like memories," she whispered. Thomas smiled despite himself. "That's exactly what it is," he said. Upstairs, Princess Nyssa stood abruptly, her robes flashing angry red. She pointed at the elaborate dessert Xanth had constructed, a hovering sphere of crystallized emotion that pulsed with artificial nostalgia. "This," she declared, her voice carrying through the hall like breaking glass, "is everything wrong with modern cuisine. Artifice pretending to be art, complexity hiding emptiness. We eat with our minds and starve our souls." High Chancellor Vorik's scales flattened with embarrassment. The princess continued, her triple-irised eyes scanning the room with contempt. "Show me real food," she demanded. "Show me something that remembers what it means to feed someone you love." The hall fell silent. And in the kitchen, 3 levels below, Thomas Blake wrapped his taco and wondered why his hands had started shaking. Thomas did not sleep well that night. He lay in his small apartment on the embassy's residential level, staring at the ceiling where someone else's footsteps echoed above him. The room smelled like the lavender soap Hannah had loved, the same brand he still bought, though it had been 3 years since she'd used it. Her picture sat on the nightstand, frozen at age 12, her smile wide and unafraid of the future she wouldn't see. She had been the one who insisted on tacos every Friday, not the fancy kind with truffle oil and microgreens, but the real ones, the ones her grandmother had taught Thomas to make before the cancer took her too. Hannah would stand on a step stool beside him, her small hands pressing tortillas with fierce concentration. She'd taste the salsa and declare it needed more lime, always more lime, until the mixture sang with citrus brightness that made them both squint. The recipe card sat in a drawer Thomas rarely opened. Her handwriting, careful and looping, spelled out instructions she'd copied during their last summer together. "Daddy's Carne Asada," the title read, though they both knew it was really Abuela's, passed down through generations who understood that food was love made visible. The card was stained with oil and time, and Thomas had laminated it after the funeral when he couldn't stop crying long enough to cook. He joined the embassy kitchen staff 6 months after Hannah died. His restaurant had closed, not from lack of skill, but from lack of heart. He couldn't stand at the stove and create beauty for strangers when the only person he'd wanted to feed was gone. The embassy job was supposed to be temporary, a way to pay bills while he figured out how to want things again. But temporary stretched into years, and years became the shape of his life. The basement kitchen became his refuge. No one asked questions there. No one expected brilliance or innovation. They needed someone reliable who could prep vegetables, clean equipment, and stay out of the way when the important chefs needed space to create their edible art. Thomas could do that. He could disappear into the rhythm of knife work, lose himself in the steam and heat, and pretend that muscle memory was enough to fill the places grief had hollowed out. But every night, after the celebrity chefs had taken their bows and the diplomats had retired to their quarters, Thomas made himself a taco. Just one, wrapped carefully, eaten slowly. He followed Hannah's recipe exactly, never varying the proportions, never experimenting with fusion or elevation. The cilantro had to be rough chopped, not minced. The onions had to be raw, not caramelized. The lime had to be squeezed by hand, not measured from a bottle. These details mattered because they were the last things she'd helped him perfect. He finished eating and washed his plate. The embassy thrummed with the vibration of sleeping aliens, their dreams unfolding in colors he couldn't imagine. Somewhere above him, a princess who hated pretense slept fitfully, hungry for something real. And Thomas Blake, who had nothing left but memory and skill, decided that tomorrow he would cook like he meant it. Thomas arrived at the kitchen before dawn, when the embassy's lights still pulsed with their nocturnal rhythm. The morning shift wouldn't start for another 2 hours, which meant he had the space to himself. He unlocked the walk-in refrigerator and selected his ingredients with the care of a jeweler choosing stones. The skirt steak had been aging for 3 days, its surface dark and promising. He carried it to his station and let it breathe, waiting for the meat to reach room temperature, the way his grandmother had insisted. The marinade came together like a prayer he'd memorized. Fresh lime juice, sharp enough to make his eyes water, garlic crushed under the flat of his blade until it wept, cumin toasted in a dry pan until the kitchen filled with earth and smoke, orange juice for sweetness, not the synthetic kind, but squeezed from fruit that remembered trees. Cilantro stems chopped fine, because that's where the flavor lived deepest. And chili powder, the kind his grandmother had brought from a market in Oaxaca, stored in a tin that Hannah had decorated with marker drawings of smiling peppers. He submerged the meat in the mixture, working it into every fiber with hands that understood patience. The steak would rest for hours, drinking in the acid and spice, transforming from simple protein into something that carried intention. While it marinated, Thomas prepared his mise en place with the precision of ritual. Onions diced so fine they were nearly translucent, cilantro washed 3 times until no grit remained, limes rolled under his palm to release their juice. Tortillas made from masa he'd mixed himself, each one pressed and cooked until it puffed with steam. The grill heated slowly, flames licking upward like eager tongues. Thomas had calibrated this particular unit himself, knew exactly which zones ran hot and which offered gentle warmth. He wasn't supposed to use it for personal cooking, but the celebrity chefs never arrived before 9, and by then all evidence of his transgression would be gone. He lifted the steak from its marinade, letting excess liquid drip away, and laid it across the grates. The sizzle rose like a song written in fat and fire. He didn't rush. Rushing was for people who cooked to impress rather than to feed. Hannah had taught him that, though she'd been too young to know she was teaching, she'd always made him wait while she arranged her taco just so, every ingredient placed with the seriousness of architecture. He'd learned patience watching her, learned that the care you brought to small things revealed the shape of your soul. The meat charred and caramelized, edges blackening, while the center stayed tender. Thomas flipped it once, added salt that had been harvested from seas on 3 continents, and let the second side develop its crust. The smoke carried memories, all the Friday nights, all the laughter, all the moments when cooking had meant family instead of simply survival. When the steak finished, he let it rest, juices redistributing, preparing itself to be transformed. Upstairs, the embassy stirred. Diplomats woke to manufactured sunlight, And in the kitchen, a father cooked like defiance tasted of cilantro and lime. Princess Nyssa woke to artificial dawn and immediate regret. Her chambers, designed to mimic Arcturian light cycles, pulsed with bioluminescent panels that did everything except feel like home. She'd spent the night dreaming of her mother's garden, where crystalline flowers bloomed in frequencies that fed both body and spirit. Here, everything tasted of diplomacy and distance. Her attendants had already laid out robes for the morning session, fabric woven with threads that responded to political temperature. She ignored them and wrapped herself in something simpler, a gesture of rebellion no one would understand. The morning briefing lasted 90 minutes. High Chancellor Vorik outlined the day's agenda with the enthusiasm of someone describing a funeral he was obligated to attend. Trade agreements, cultural exchanges, the tedious machinery of peace between species who barely tolerated each other. Ambassador Reeve added clarifications that clarified nothing. Attaché Kess took notes with dimming bioluminescent patterns that suggested she hadn't slept. Princess Nyssa listened with half her attention, while the other half wondered why she'd agreed to this diplomatic tour at all. Breakfast arrived on floating trays, another molecular masterpiece from Chef Xanth. Deconstructed proteins arranged like abstract art. Foams that tasted of concepts rather than food. Spheres of liquid nutrition that burst with algorithmic precision. Princess Nyssa consumed it dutifully while feeling nothing except a hollow kind of fullness. Her people had evolved beyond hunger centuries ago, replacing biological need with aesthetic appreciation. But lately she'd begun to suspect they'd lost something in the translation. The morning session convened in the Hall of Accords, where representatives from 7 systems argued about shipping routes and tariff structures. Princess Nyssa sat in her designated seat, her robes shifting to diplomatic blue, and tried to care about percentages and protocols. High Chancellor Vorik spoke with aggressive certainty about Arcturian interests. Ambassador Reeve nodded with practiced enthusiasm. The hours crawled past like wounded things. And then, sometime between the discussion of mineral rights and the debate over cultural preservation, a scent drifted through the ventilation system. It arrived subtly at first, just a whisper of something different threading through the recycled air. Princess Nyssa's triple-irised eyes widened. Her robes flickered from blue to confused silver. The scent grew stronger, carrying notes she couldn't name, but somehow recognized. Smoke and citrus and something green that spoke of growing things. Spices that had been coaxed from earth rather than synthesized in laboratories. Around her, other delegates continued their debate, oblivious. But Attaché Kess had lifted her head, antennae quivering with sudden attention. Their eyes met across the chamber, and in that glance passed a question neither could answer. "What is that?" Princess Nyssa whispered. Kess shook her head slowly, but her bioluminescent patterns brightened with something that looked like hunger. The scent intensified, curling through the hall like an invitation written in smoke. It smelled like memory, though Princess Nyssa had no memory that matched it. It smelled like home, though her home had never produced anything remotely similar. Most impossibly, it smelled like love, which was a flavor she'd only read about in anthropological texts. High Chancellor Vorik droned on about export regulations. And 3 levels below, Thomas Blake sliced Carne Asada with hands that remembered everything. Princess Nyssa left the session without explanation. Her robes flashed colors that made her attendants nervous, shifting from diplomatic blue to determined crimson to something that resembled hunger, though hunger wasn't supposed to exist anymore. High Chancellor Vorik called after her, mandibles clicking with confusion, but she was already gone, following the scent through corridors that twisted like questions without answers. Attaché Kess hurried behind, tablets forgotten, driven by the same inexplicable pull. The embassy's architecture was designed to keep important people away from unimportant spaces. Service corridors branched off main halls, marked with symbols that meant nothing to those who never looked. Princess Nyssa followed her senses, triple-irised eyes, tracking the scent like a hunting creature following prey. Down one level, then another, past storage, rooms and maintenance closets, until the marble gave way to concrete and the air grew thick with steam. The kitchen door was propped open with a wooden wedge. Princess Nyssa stood at the threshold, her robes settling into cautious violet. Inside, a human man worked at a grill, his back to the entrance, completely unaware he had an audience. He moved with the efficiency of someone who'd performed these actions 10,000 times, slicing meat against the grain, arranging it on handmade tortillas, adding ingredients with the precision of a chemist measuring compounds. The scent rolled off the grill in waves that made Princess Nyssa's chest tighten with something she couldn't name. Thomas sensed the presence before he turned. The air changed when royalty entered a room, even royalty that pretended to be humble. He looked over his shoulder and found the princess standing in his doorway, her luminous eyes fixed on the taco he'd just assembled. Behind her, attaché caisse vibrated with nervous energy. Thomas wiped his hands on his apron and tried to remember if there was a protocol for this situation. "What is that?" Princess Nyssa asked, her voice softer than it had been in the grand hall. Thomas looked at the taco, then back at her. "Dinner," he said. She moved closer, drawn by forces older than diplomacy. The tortilla was imperfect, handmade, bearing the marks of human hands. The meat glistened with juice and char. The cilantro and onions sat like jewels on top, simple and unpretentious. "May I?" she asked, and the question came out like a confession. Thomas hesitated only a moment before nodding. He plated the taco carefully and handed it to her. Princess Nyssa held it like it might evaporate, studying the way ingredients nestled together. Attaché caisse leaned forward, hardly breathing. The princess lifted the taco to her lips and took a bite. The flavor hit like memory made solid. Smoke and spice and the bright, sharp song of lime. The meat yielded under her teeth, tender and complex. But beneath the taste lay something else, something her people had engineered away. Care. Intention. Love translated into seasoning and heat. Her robe cycled through a dozen colors in 3 seconds, unable to settle on a single emotion. She took another bite, then another, and when the taco was gone, she looked at Thomas with eyes that held questions and answers in equal measure. "Teach me," she whispered. Princess Nyssa returned the next night, and the night after that, slipping away from state dinners and diplomatic receptions with excuses that grew thinner each time. High Chancellor Vorik grew suspicious, Ambassador Reeve worried openly, but attaché caisse kept their secret, standing guard at the service corridor while the princess learned things her tutors had never taught. Thomas didn't ask why she came. He simply made space at his station and showed her how to hold a knife. Her hands, designed for manipulating holographic interfaces and signing treaties with light, struggled with the weight of a chef's blade. Thomas guided her fingers into position, teaching her to curl her knuckles like a cat's paw, the way he'd taught Hannah. The onions made her cry, which startled her. Arcturians had evolved beyond tears, or so she'd thought. "These are different," Thomas explained quietly. "These are the good kind, the kind that mean you're alive and doing something real." He taught her that cooking was a language spoken in actions rather than words. The way you treated ingredients revealed how you treated the world. Rushing meant you didn't care. Precision without heart meant you feared failure more than you desired success. But patience combined with attention, that was love made visible. Princess Nyssa, who had been taught to lead with authority and speak with calculated effect, found herself learning to listen to meat as it cooked, to trust her senses over her analysis. The tortillas defeated her at first. She pressed too hard, then too soft, creating misshapen circles that cracked when they hit the heat. Thomas didn't correct her with words. He simply showed her again, his weathered hands moving with a gentleness that made her chest ache. She tried again and again until finally a tortilla puffed with steam and she laughed, a sound she hadn't made since childhood. Attaché caisse, watching from the doorway, recorded the moment not in her official tablets, but in the private archive of her memory. Thomas told her about Hannah while they waited for meat to marinate. Not the whole story, not yet, but pieces of it. How she'd loved Fridays. How she'd insisted on tasting everything, adjusting seasonings with the confidence of someone who trusted her palate. How cooking had been their language when words felt inadequate. Princess Nyssa listened without the diplomatic filters she usually employed, and when he went quiet, she didn't fill the silence with platitudes. She simply stood beside him and chopped cilantro until her hands smelled like green growing things. On the fifth night, she made her first complete taco without assistance. The meat was slightly overcooked, and she'd been too generous with the lime. But when she took a bite, her robes blazed with colors Thomas had never seen. "This tastes like caring about the outcome," she said softly. Thomas nodded. "That's the whole point," he replied. She sat on an overturned crate in the corner of his kitchen, eating slowly. And for the first time since arriving on Earth, Princess Nyssa of Arcturus felt something other than duty. She felt fed. High Chancellor Vorik found them on the seventh night. He'd been tracking the princess through the embassy's surveillance network, growing increasingly alarmed by her absences from official functions. When the monitors showed her entering the service levels, he assembled a delegation and descended with the righteous fury of someone whose authority had been questioned. Ambassador Reeve followed reluctantly, antennae drooping with dread. Behind them came a cluster of Arcturian nobles, their robes already shifting to judgmental shades of crimson and black. They burst into the kitchen like a storm breaking. Princess Nyssa stood at the grill, her hands dusted with masa, her robes simplified to working gray. Thomas was beside her, guiding her through the delicate process of warming tortillas without burning them. Attaché Kess, caught mid-warning at the doorway, froze with her tablets clutched against her chest. The smell of Carne Asada hung in the air like evidence of treason. Vorik's scales flared with outrage. "My princess! What degradation is this? You lower yourself to manual labor. You consort with kitchen staff. You consume primitive food prepared by human hands." His voice echoed off the concrete walls, harsh as breaking glass. The nobles behind him hissed agreement, their collective disapproval filling the small space like toxic gas. Ambassador Reeve stepped forward, trying to soften the blow. "Perhaps if we discuss this privately," she began, but Vorik cut her off with a slash of his clawed hand. Princess Nyssa set down the tortilla she'd been warming. Her robes shifted slowly from gray to something metallic and unyielding. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I am learning," she said simply. "Learning what?" Vorik spat. "To debase yourself, to forget your station, to play at being common." The word dripped with venom. Around him the nobles murmured agreement, though Attaché Kess noticed that some looked uncertain, their eyes drifting to the food with something that might have been curiosity. Thomas started to step back, to make himself invisible the way he'd learned to do, but Princess Nyssa touched his arm. "Stay," she said quietly. Then she turned to face her court with a calm that came from certainty rather than arrogance. "I am learning that food can be a language we forgot how to speak. I am learning that precision without care creates beauty without meaning. I am learning that we elevated ourselves so far above necessity that we lost the ability to nurture or be nurtured." Vorik's mandibles clicked furiously. "Sentiment," he declared. "Weakness disguised as wisdom. You risk diplomatic relationships for folded bread and dead meat." Princess Nyssa reached for the taco she and Thomas had prepared together. She held it up like a document requiring authentication. "This folded bread, as you call it, has taught me more about connection than a decade of treaty negotiations." She took a deliberate bite, maintaining eye contact with Vorik while she chewed. Her robes blazed with defiant gold. The Chancellor stepped forward, claws extended. "Then choose, Princess, your crown or your kitchen lessons, your duty or your human cook." The nobles waited for her submission. Thomas held his breath, and Princess Nyssa, who had spent her whole life being told what mattered, realized she finally knew the answer. Princess Nyssa did not choose. Instead, she issued a decree that sent shockwaves through every diplomatic channel in the embassy. There would be a feast, she announced, prepared not by molecular gastronomists or celebrity chefs, but by Thomas Blake, the human cook from the basement kitchen. Every delegate, every ambassador, every member of the Arcturian court would attend, and they would eat what he prepared with the same attention they gave to treaties and trade agreements. High Chancellor Vorik protested with every weapon in his diplomatic arsenal. "This is unprecedented," he declared. "Dangerous. An insult to centuries of protocol." Ambassador Reeve tried to negotiate a compromise, perhaps a fusion menu, something that wouldn't completely overturn tradition, but Princess Nyssa's robes had settled into a shade of blue so deep it was almost black, the color of decisions that cannot be unmade. "The feast will happen," she said, and her voice carried the weight of royal lineage that predated Vorik's appointment by millennia. Thomas spent 3 days preparing. The embassy provided him with assistants, but he sent most of them away, keeping only Attaché Kess, who had proven she could chop cilantro without crushing its soul. Together they pressed 200 tortillas by hand. They marinated enough carne asada to feed 9 species, adjusting the spice levels after Princess Nyssa tested each batch. They diced onions until they both cried, the good kind of tears, the kind that meant something real was being created. The night of the feast, the grand hall was transformed. The molecular cuisine stations were dismantled. The hovering trays and holographic menus disappeared. In their place, Thomas set up grills that filled the space with smoke and promise. Long tables appeared, covered not with smart fabric that adjusted to each diner's aesthetic preferences, but with simple cloth that had been woven by human hands on earth looms. The delegates arrived in states ranging from curious to horrified. Thomas cooked in front of them all, his movement steady despite being watched by beings who could disintegrate him with a thought. He grilled the meat in batches, each piece receiving the same attention he'd give if cooking for one. Princess Nyssa stood beside him, not as decoration, but as assistant, warming tortillas and arranging toppings with the careful precision she'd learned. Attaché Kess moved through the crowd with trays, offering tacos to diplomats who accepted them like unfamiliar artifacts requiring authentication. High Chancellor Vorik refused at first, standing with his arms crossed and his scales rigid with disapproval, but around him something unexpected happened. A Valorian senator took a bite and went very still, her bioluminescent patterns brightening with surprise. A Threxian ambassador consumed his taco in 3 bites, then immediately requested another. Ambassador Reeve ate slowly, her antennae quivering with something between shock and delight. Even the most skeptical nobles found themselves reaching for seconds. The hall grew quiet in a way it never had during formal dinners. No debates, no posturing, just beings from across the galaxy discovering what it meant to be fed by someone who cared about feeding them. Vorik watched his certainty crumble like poorly made pastry. And when Princess Nyssa offered him a taco with both hands, he finally understood what she'd been trying to teach him. The changes came slowly at first, then all at once, the way tides shift when the moon finally commits to pulling. The Grand Hall's molecular cuisine stations remained dismantled. In their place, the embassy installed kitchens from a dozen worlds, each one designed not for spectacle, but for the practical magic of feeding people who gathered in good faith. Arcturian crystal ovens stood beside Threxian smoke pits. Valorian hydroponic gardens grew next to earth soil beds where tomatoes remembered sunshine. Princess Nyssa commissioned a new wing, built at ground level, where everyone could enter without descending into shame. She called it the Hall of Shared Tables, and she appointed Thomas Blake as its first director. He accepted on the condition that his title would be simple: cook, not executive chef, not culinary director, just cook. The kind of word that meant you showed up every day and did the work that fed people. Princess Nyssa agreed, and her robes shimmered with a gold that looked like respect. The kitchen became a place where diplomats learned to dice onions alongside maintenance staff, where alien nobles discovered that yeast didn't care about bloodlines, only temperature and time, where High Chancellor Vorik, humbled and surprisingly teachable, spent his mornings learning to press tortillas under Thomas's patient instruction. His first attempts were disasters, misshapen and burnt, but he kept trying with a determination that looked like penance and grew into something better. Attaché Kess became the kitchen's unofficial chronicler, documenting recipes and stories with equal care. She learned that every dish carried history, that food was memory made edible, and that the act of cooking together built bridges more durable than any treaty. Her reports to the Arcturian Council focused less on trade agreements and more on the way shared meals transformed enemies into colleagues, then colleagues into something closer to friends. Thomas still thought of Hannah every time he cooked. The ache hadn't disappeared, would never disappear, but it had changed shape. Grief had been a weight that crushed him into stillness. Now it was a current that moved him forward, connecting past to present through the simple act of feeding people who were hungry for more than nutrition. He taught Hannah's recipe to anyone who asked, and in teaching it, he kept her alive in ways that transcended memory. On Friday evenings, the kitchen closed to official functions and opened for something quieter. Thomas would prepare tacos for whoever showed up. No reservations required, no credentials necessary. Princess Nyssa always came, leaving her crown in her chambers and wearing robes the color of working gray. She would stand at the grill beside him, their hands moving in the synchronized rhythm of people who'd learned the same language. Around them, beings from across the galaxy would gather, not as diplomats or nobles or staff, but as people who understood that sitting down to eat together was the first act of choosing peace. The embassy's towers still reached toward stars like frozen embers. But 3 levels down, where the ceiling dripped with steam and the walls remembered older fires, a kitchen hummed with the most radical act in the universe, the simple revolutionary practice of feeding each other with care.